you so much for being here with me today and watching this video. This is the third video in the Module 1 series where we're talking about psychology as a science. And in this particular video, I'm going to discuss information literacy and its relationship to psychology. All right. So in my last two videos, I was really focusing on some of the errors in judgment that most people make, either due to over-reliance on intuition or truthiness, or over-reliance on unreliable mental shortcuts called heuristics. Okay, so I'm going to talk more in this video about why that's important, or why these types of errors in judgment are significant in our discussion of psychological science. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and shoot some examples at you guys right away. All right, so evidence overwhelmingly suggests that smoking, drinking, and consuming fatty foods negatively affect health outcomes, right? So there's definitive and overwhelming scientific evidence that engaging in these behaviors has a negative impact on your health, right? But overwhelmingly, right? I'm sure that doctors and medical professionals who communicate this to their patients, or even family members who communicate this to their other family members, right, probably get a response like this, right? So if you say, drinking and eating fatty foods and using tobacco products is going to lead to all sorts of negative health outcomes, a lot of times what people respond with is, yeah, but my uncle lived to be 92 and he drank and smoked and ate junk food every single day until he died, right? So what that response illustrates is what's called person who statistics and anecdotal evidence, right? So this would occur when your knowledge or prediction about the probability of a given outcome, in this case negative health outcomes, is driven entirely by stories that you've heard or experiences that you've had, rather than taking into account scientific evidence, right? Similarly, a lot of evidence overwhelmingly suggests that long-term retention of information is better when your study sessions are spaced out in time rather than when they're crammed together, right? So engaging in what's called distributive practice is going to be better for your learning of information than cramming the night before, right? But overwhelmingly, when I share this with students, right, their response is something like, well, I've crammed for every chemistry test since I started at Mercer, right? And I still remember everything I've learned, right? So what happens is we tend to overvalue our own experiences and those of others, okay, and try to draw inferences from single cases, okay? So we tend to overvalue our experiences and the experiences of people that we know, and we tend to want to draw inferences or make inferences from these single cases, right? So we have a very strong tendency to prefer quick, simple explanations over more complex ones. Right? So why is this a problem, or why is this considered unscientific when we rely on anecdotal evidence? Well, almost everyone can think of one example of someone who led an unhealthy lifestyle but lived to be 100, right? And mistakenly conclude that this result means that unhealthy lifestyles don't decrease life expectancy, right? Similarly, if researchers take a sample of 5 people and average their IQ scores, right, the average is likely to be higher or lower than 100, which is the national average, right? Whereas if the researchers take a sample of 1,000 people, the average is likely to be closer to 100. So what does this illustrate? Well, it illustrates two concepts, right? So when we talk about our uncle that drank and smoked and ate pork rinds every day until he died, or when we talk about the person who crammed for every single chemistry test they ever had and still won the Nobel Prize, right? We're talking about outliers. So outliers are cases or instances that are distinct from the majority of cases, right? So another way of thinking about an outlier is an oddball that doesn't conform to the average case, right? And related to this is something called the law of small numbers, right? So oddballs or outliers are more likely to occur when we consider a small number of cases, right? So if we think about the example of our uncle or the example of the chemistry whiz, right? If we think about how we're extrapolating or how we're making this inference, we are only considering the experiences of a single individual, right? And that means we have a very, 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 very small sample size, right? So if our sample only consists of a single individual, okay, it's going to be far, far, far more likely that that individual is an extreme case or an outlier, right? As opposed to if we were to administer a study habits survey or a health outcome survey to 1,000 people, right? It's much more likely that we would see a benefit of distributed practice as opposed to cramming, or that we would see the negative consequences of consumption of alcohol and junk food. Okay? So again, the dangers of anecdotal evidence, just like the dangers of relying on heuristics, right, is that we're discounting information that is critically important when we are attempting to draw inferences or reach conclusions. Okay, so how does that relate to scientific literacy? Well, first off, what is scientific literacy? Scientific literacy is just knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts and processes required for personal decision making, participation in civic and cultural events, and economic productivity. So scientific literacy is essentially an understanding of how scientists think. Okay? So interestingly enough, perhaps sadly enough, research has shown that only 25% of the population is estimated to be scientifically literate. And that 25% has actually greatly increased compared to 10% of the population who is scientifically literate 2 decades ago, right? So even though it's improving, there's still a very small percentage of the population that is scientifically literate. Okay? Well, the next question might be, how do we cultivate scientific literacy, right? Well, you might think the number one predictor of scientific literacy, or the number one indicator that someone might be scientifically literate, is that person is a scientist, right? But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So just because you have been trained in scientific methodology that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to meet the criteria for being scientifically literate. So, for example, there is an individual named John E. Mack. And John E. Mack is a very well respected and highly trained psychiatrist, who actually got his MD from Harvard Medical School, right? So his scientific training is far superior compared to that of most of the population of scientists out there. However, his understanding of scientific literacy is somewhat suspect. And the reason why I say that is John E. Mack is a firm believer in alien abduction. Right? So to date, even though people have been talking about alien abduction for over a century, to date, there is absolutely no scientific evidence of aliens or alien abduction. And yet, John E. Mack is a very firm believer in alien abduction. So he has been, quote, researching, end quote, alien abduction for a very long time. And in fact, he wrote a book called Abduction, in which he talked about 76 cases of alleged alien abduction. And in that book, he talked about the two main reasons why aliens abduct humans. One of those reasons, he alleged, was changing human consciousness to prevent the destruction of Earth's ecosystems. And the second one was creating offspring from aliens and humans. Okay? So this is literally like a scientist, guys, who has patients and writes prescriptions and things of that nature. And yet he is firmly convinced that aliens are trying to abduct us and make babies with us. Okay? So I'm not really going to say any more about that other than to say that being a scientist doesn't necessarily mean that you are scientifically literate. Okay? All right, so how do we cultivate scientific literacy? Well, the good news is that psychology is actually, most of the time, an ideal discipline for developing scientific literacy. So let's look at some of the evidence demonstrating why psychology is superior in this respect. So the first piece of evidence, and I apologize, this graph is kind of difficult to see. But what this graph is showing is the number of pages in psychology textbooks devoted to discussion of scientific literacy. So these were all introductory textbooks, and they were organized by discipline. So chemistry and physics introductory textbooks have 1.4 and 1.6 pages respectively devoted to discussion of scientific literacy. Biology has 6.9 pages devoted to scientific literacy. Sociology has 12.2 pages devoted to scientific literacy. And psychology wins by a landslide with 18.4 pages devoted to scientific literacy. So again, what that suggests is right out of the gate, people studying psychology are being informed about scientific literacy. Okay, another graph I have here for you guys This graph is showing scientific literacy scores as a function of the number of psychology courses students complete, right? So again, there are various tests out there that look at scientific literacy as kind of an abstract construct. And what they find is that as the number of psychology courses one has taken increases from 0 to 6, individuals make very gradual and very definitive gains in their scientific literacy ability or understanding, right? So when we start out, we have we score around 14.2 on this metric of scientific literacy, and that increases after 6 plus psychology courses to 16.5 or so, which is a significant difference. Okay, and we see the same sorts of increases as students are progressing from more entry-level courses to more advanced courses, right? So as the courses get more complex, people are showing greater gains in scientific literacy. So why is it that psychology seems to be ideal for cultivating scientific literacy? Well, one reason why psychology is so adept in this regard is that psychological explanations are generally more complex than those in other fields, such as chemistry and physics. Now, by complexity, I don't mean which of these disciplines is more difficult or which of these disciplines is more advanced or more worthwhile. I just mean psychology tends to be more complex in terms of how many factors we have to consider when explaining even very simple behavior, right? So even when we're explaining a very simple behavior, we have to take into account, for example, one's gender, one's age, one's mood, one's culture, one's level of fatigue, and so on, because all of those factors are going to exert an influence, right? In contrast, explaining the behavior of a chemical compound, right, by comparison, simply requires knowing the state of 1 to 2 variables or elements at a time, right? So just the sheer number of factors that we have to consider, even to explain something relatively rudimentary, increases the degree to which we have to be scientifically literate. The other primary reason why psychology tends to cultivate scientific literacy is the fact that psychology is a hub science. So, analysis of over 7,000 journals and over 1 million articles in the social and natural sciences has revealed connections between psychology, biology, physics, chemistry, medicine, and neuroscience. Okay? So all of those connections, what that suggests is that sciences critical to other sciences should be cited frequently by other disciplines, right? So scientists from biology, neuroscience, medicine, chemistry, and physics all cite psychology research in their own work. Right? So therefore, psychology seems to be a science that is fundamental to many other branches of both natural and social science. Okay? So, what is the relative importance of scientific literacy, or why have we been talking about it so much? Well, the main benefit of scientific literacy is that it allows us to distinguish between science and pseudoscience, right? Or it allows us to better understand what characterizes the scientific approach, right? So sometimes people have unscientific or pseudoscientific ideas because they're actively trying to deceive you. But in some case, they have pseudoscientific beliefs simply because they don't know that science doesn't support their beliefs, right? So people who are under the impression that, for example, learning styles are effective, or that baby Einstein videos are ideal for expanding young minds. Those are people who hold pseudoscientific beliefs simply because they don't know what the scientific evidence suggests, right? So really our goal here is to effectively distinguish beliefs that are grounded in science from beliefs that are not, using our scientific literacy skills. So what characterizes the scientific approach? Well, the number one characteristic of the scientific approach is that science is data-driven. So scientists generate ideas and test them by collecting data. Once we analyze the data, we generate testable predictions that go beyond what we already know to see if our new ideas are sound. Okay? So we collect data and see if that data supports our predictions or not. And we have to be willing to change our ideas if the data doesn't support them, right? So if the data goes against our hypothesis or our predictions, we have to be open to changing them. So the second characteristic that exemplifies the scientific approach is that science is objective. So when we conduct a study as psychologists, we define our ideas clearly so that others can understand and evaluate them. Okay? So in studying people and their behaviors, we sometimes need to use measurements that represent a concept because we can't access that concept directly, right? So for example, if we want to measure a person's level of depression, we would use a standardized test, right, such as the Beck Depression Inventory, because depression itself is an internal and emotional process that we can't observe directly, right? So this definition isn't necessarily perfect, but it is objective in the sense that outsiders can look at that measurement. They can look at that measurement tool and understand what is involved and use it themselves, right? So it's directly empirical or observable. Right? Next, scientific research is verifiable. So other researchers must be able to conduct follow-up research to see if an original set of results holds up. Okay? Sometimes subsequent research doesn't lead to the same results. Okay? And that doesn't mean that the original research that was conducted isn't scientific. It just means that we need more research or more experiments to figure out what's going on, right? So the question of validity of research findings received, for example, considerable attention in the replication project that was started by Brian Nosek and initiated in 2011, right? So as part of the replication project, psychologists were tasked with conducting a classic psychology experiments exactly how they were conducted by the original researchers to see if the effects replicated or if the same results were observed. And of the 100 psychological studies that were repeated by independent researchers, 39 of them led to the same outcome. So they obtained the same results as the original researchers. And 24 resulted in moderately similar results. So there were some disparities between the most recent experiment and the original experiment, but they were mostly similar. And then in a little over 1/3 of the studies that were replicated, they found totally different outcomes, right? So this brought a lot of criticism that led many people to say that psychological research was not credible. However, further analysis led researchers to conclude, right, that the replication project was flawed, right? So what made the replication flawed was that, for instance, studies investigating racial biases against African Americans were replicated in Italy, where racial attitudes differ significantly as compared to those in the United States, right? So it turns out that psychological research is more replicable than cancer and pharmacology research, right? And many other areas of natural sciences. It just so happens that, again, because psychological research is so complex, even in replicating previous research findings, we have to be aware of how different variables might differently affect the results, right? So even if you use identical surveys, right, identical measurement instruments, and you try to uphold the same procedures and measurement tools used by previous researchers, you have to take into account very important variables like culture in this case, okay? But when they compared how reproducible psychological research was as compared to other sciences, they found that in many cases, other sciences didn't have replicable results. And we could see this particularly with pharmacology research when we think about the influence of drug companies, for example, and how motivated they are fiscally to get research that supports the efficacy of certain drugs. So there's all kinds of unethical things happening there that might lead to favorable results that are not necessarily replicable. Okay, so we'll talk more about that. But again, the idea is that scientific research has to be verified or replicated definitively in order for it to be considered scientific. Okay, so the last one is science is public, right? So researchers must make their findings and their methods available to others who can assess the validity of the research and conclusions, right? So that's typically done through the process of peer review, where you write up your results of the experiment and you talk about your hypotheses, your predictions, any relevant background research, and you detail the methodology that you used, the measurement instruments that you used, and the results that you found, along with the overarching conclusions, right? And other researchers in your field read that manuscript and are tasked with determining whether it's appropriate or not, right? So it isn't acceptable for a scientist to make a claim, but then to refuse to share any details of the investigation, right? So a scientist always has to give a lot of information about how their research was investigated and what their results demonstrated. Okay, so let's compare the scientific approach with some of the claims or characteristics of pseudoscientific claims, right? So the first sort of characteristic feature of pseudoscientific claims is acceptance of anecdotes and coincidence, right? So say, for example, someone has a dream of a person, okay? So they dream about a person, and then they get a phone call from that same person the next day, right? This particular anecdote is often accepted as evidence of what's called precognition, or the ability to predict future events, right? Because this feeling is so powerful, right? But in a nutshell, I mean, this is basically nothing more than coincidence, and it doesn't actually demonstrate evidence of anything, right? So this is purely coincidence, and it comes from anecdotes rather than anything that is scientifically verifiable, right? So acceptance of anecdotes and coincidence. Another characteristic of the pseudoscientific approach or pseudoscientific claims is the belief that the unexplained is proof, right? So one sort of really unfortunate phenomenon is that in some cases there have been ships and airplanes that have completely disappeared without a trace. Okay, so there have been documented cases where we have been unable to locate planes and ships from all around the world, right? They seemingly have disappeared into thin air, right? And so this phenomenon where ships and airplanes vanish has led some people to believe in the existence of something called the Bermuda Triangle in the North Atlantic Ocean, right? So they believe that the Bermuda Triangle is the location where staggering numbers of unidentified planes and ships have disappeared to, right? So the reason why we can't find all of these ships and planes is because they were sucked into the Bermuda Triangle, right? And that's taken as the fact that we have this many disappearances is taken as evidence of supernatural activity in the Bermuda Triangle, right? When in reality, in actuality, this area of the Atlantic Ocean that makes up the Bermuda Triangle is no more prone to disappearance than any other, right? So ships and planes that were near the Bermuda Triangle are no more likely to disappear than those that weren't anywhere near it, right? So again, pseudoscientific claims tend to assert that if we can't explain a phenomenon like this disappearance of all these planes and ships, that means that there's some sort of supernatural activity going on. So another characteristic that is found in many pseudoscientific claims is that they rely on or anticipate the use of confirmation bias, right? So for example, if a psychic, right, makes a prediction that comes true, people tend to remember it vividly. However, they forget many failures that psychics have in terms of their ability to accurately forecast events, right, that might happen in the future, right? So people tend to remember the times that a psychic was correct and forget all of the times that a psychic was incorrect in their claims. They also tend to give a fairly wide latitude when it comes to predictions. So a lot of psychics tend to predict generalities that are merely in the right ballpark rather than giving specific information, right? So people tend to be very forgiving in those instances and again seem to look for evidence preferentially that supports the notion that the psychic is actually able to predict the future. So our fourth and final characteristic of pseudoscientific claims is the use of unverifiable claims from the past as proof. So there is a writer by the name of Eric von Daniken who claims to have found a landing strip in Peru that he alleges extraterrestrial visitors supposedly used in the remote past. Okay? But apparently the aliens must have found a better landing strip elsewhere, maybe Roswell, New Mexico, or some other location, because there's no such records in recorded history of aliens ever visiting this area of Peru. Right? So one of the most significant characteristics of pseudoscience is the use of claims or beliefs that are totally unverifiable, either through science or through the historical record. Oh, one final thing I wanted to note, which is kind of important, is why this matters, right? So why does scientific literacy matter? Why should we worry about this? Well, I wanted to give you an example of why scientific literacy is so important. So, in a Colorado courtroom, a man was on trial for driving while intoxicated. When the police pulled him over, he had an open beer container in his car with his fingerprints on it. Right? He couldn't walk in a straight line, and his blood alcohol level was above the legal limit. Even with this evidence, the jury acquitted him. Right? So this outcome astonished the prosecutor, and when the prosecutor asked the jurors what motivated their decision, they reported that an astrologer on the jury did an astrological reading of the defendant, and based on his birth date, found that according to astrological laws, there's no way he could have been drunk that day. Okay? And the jury accepted the argument and acquitted him despite the fact that scientific studies long ago concluded that astrology has no basis in scientific fact. Right? So this is just one example, one of numerous examples where a lack of scientific literacy has very real consequences, right? In that someone who is guilty of a very significant crime was not actually prosecuted. Right? But there are many other examples. So for example, medical decision making, effective medical decision making often requires an understanding or an ability to distinguish pseudoscience from science. So one example is, of course, the overwhelming evidence that there is no relationship or no causal connection between vaccines and autism spectrum disorders, right? And in fact, it has been definitively proven that the original study citing vaccines as a potential cause for autism has been thoroughly discredited and was in fact entirely fabricated. The data was entirely fabricated, and yet many people continue to refuse to vaccinate their children under the assumption that vaccines cause autism. Right? Another example is the treatment of ADHD. Right? So ADHD is caused by many different chemical and structural changes in the brain, most notably deficient levels of dopamine, and also a reduced prefrontal cortex. Right? So these are again definitive causes of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that have been demonstrated across multiple studies. And yet there are individuals who claim that ADHD is caused by preservatives found in food, right? So if you want to treat your own ADHD or your child's ADHD, all you need to do is feed them preservative-free food, right? And it's entirely possible, and in fact probable, that preservatives are bad for you and might be associated with a number of negative health outcomes, right? But there is absolutely no scientific evidence that consumption of preservatives makes you more likely to experience the consequences of ADHD, right? So if people are unable to determine or distinguish science from pseudoscience, not only does that have implications for the criminal justice system, apparently, but it also determines how likely or how effectively we are able to manage very significant health outcomes and disorders and things of that nature. So scientific literacy has a lot of very far-reaching implications that go beyond the classroom. So this concludes my final video on psychology as a science. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it informative. And certainly if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. And I look forward to seeing you in my next lecture video. Take care.